Okay, welcome back. Clearly you were all having really interesting conversations because no one wanted to come back before the time was up. Hopefully that's a good thing. And we're talking, the question was all about home because today's topic is all about Zionism and the Uganda Proposal in the 6th Zionist Conference in 1903. So, in putting all of this together, I realized that there's probably, yeah, Lisa?
1900 what? You blanked out.
3.
But okay. Thanks.
So I realized in order to talk about this, there's probably a whole bunch of background that we need, including what is Zionism, who's Theodore Herzl, and it kind of what Judaism and Reform Judaism has to say about the concept of return to home, whatever that means. So, a really quick, like super quick, incredibly simplistic definition of Zionism. Zionism is a political, spiritual, religious, all sorts of cultural effort, and there's different streams of Zionism, each with all of those names. Hope for a return to what, when Zionism first was created, was called Zion. There was no such thing as Israel. This is the mid-1800s, and the middle-late 1800s that it was just starting to be talked about as Zionism. Because up until that point, Israel was the people of Israel, the land of Israel, the children of Israel, but there was no modern state of Israel, which wasn't founded until 1948. And Israel wasn't really a term used to be specific to the area that we now know as the modern state of Israel. Way back in the day, like in the Book of Kings and etc., there was the Kingdom of Israel, which was a kind of, if you can picture, you don't need to picture it, I can pull up a map. The map of the Middle East, it kind of went from approximately the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Here we go, pulling that up. So, share screen. So went approximately, I'm going to zoom in even more here. Thumbs up if you can see it. Yeah, excellent. It went approximately from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea here, and probably didn't go all the way down to what we now know as a lot down here. Probably had some area in the desert here, probably like Beersheba was probably a part of the Kingdom of Israel, and definitely to the Kinneret Sea up here. But we don't really have any kind of borders that we have on a map now for what the ancient Kingdom of Israel was. And that kingdom only really existed for a generation or two before it was split in half. To the Kingdom of Judea in the south, Kingdom of Israel in the north, and then the kingdoms. Those two kingdoms only existed for a couple generations before they too were destroyed. So Israel wasn't really a term that was used. It was all about Zion. That's the phrase that we hear in the books of prophets about a return to Zion. And the specific area has been in flux ever since the Declaration of Independence of Israel was signed. It pretty much every war that Israel has been involved in, those borders have changed, and they are still changing, and they are still very much up for debate. So we're going to try not to get into modern Israeli politics. It'll be hard, but we're going to try not to delve too far into all of that complicated, and just stick with the idea of Zionism. So, is anyone, let's start with this question. What is all of your various backgrounds or lack thereof with Zionism? Do you consider yourself Zionists? Was it something taught to you by families or communities or anything like that? What's your relationship with Zionism? Joel, and then Shelley.
My father was a very Reform Jew and pretty much an anti-Zionist. And now it didn't affect me because I was off in the other direction. But I knew that era, and I'm old enough to remember when people didn't embrace Israel and didn't want there to be an Israel and were offended by the fact that that people wanted to have it, or that then it became and it existed, and they didn't want that, because I think it affected their ability to move within America without being noticed as Jews.
Yeah, and we're going to get more deeply into why, that phrase, your father was very Reform and therefore anti-Zionist. We'll get into kind of the early Reform positions on Zionism and where that change really started to occur. Not with the Holocaust, as a lot of people believe, but a little bit earlier than that. Shelley.
I grew up in a Zionist home. My mother was a pioneer woman. I went to a Zionist day overnight camp as a child. 1 year, I remember. And we had very strong feeling about, but my folks both came from Poland also. So in their hometowns in the shtetl, they were all Zionists also.
Yeah, and that word pioneer carries a lot of weight in the Zionist community, right? A pioneer Zionist is a Jew who kind of leaves behind the yeshiva and the kind of, I don't know how to describe this without using Yiddish, the nebbishy kind of like pale glasses, not super muscular person. And kind of leaves all of that behind in order to become an agriculturalist and to, right, the phrase was to make the desert bloom. And that was kind of the idea of that pioneer. The Halutzim were the ones who were going to go plant the desert. So Halutzim means pioneers. Sue, is that your hand? And then Brian.
Okay, am I on?
You're on. Yeah.
Okay. My mother her family was from Germany. She was born in this country. She was also an anti-Zionist, and was brought up Reform. However, I never had that feeling. She never bad talked it. She just said, I believe that this country is where I am. And I always felt that Israel, I remember writing a theme in 8th grade to go to camp, Herzl. And it was, do I believe in dual loyalty? And I obviously at that time did. I believed that I could both be Jewish and an American and also have a feeling for Israel. So even though she was anti-Zionist, I was not ever. And we've since taken our kids. So obviously, I don't know why I changed, but I felt that Israel was part of being Jewish, I guess.
Yeah, and again, you guys are all using these wonderful Zionist kind of buzz phrases. That dual loyalty became such a sticking point. Can you be American or German or any other nationality and still support Israel? What happens if it becomes a conflict? Can you have dual loyalty? Became a big conversation really around like the 50s and 60s when Zionists Americans were, finally starting to gain a little bit of ground. And then that conversation became like, how do I have essentially two nationalities at the same time and equally passionate about both? Awesome. Brian.
Question. Can you be, or could you be, a Zionist without picturing yourself individually as one who felt the need to return and become part of it, as opposed to just supporting others?
Well, that is also another big Zionist question. Can you be Zionist while living in the diaspora? And so diaspora is, it comes from that Greek word of being displaced. And, most Jews, when they try to explain, where do they live? Most American Jews would say, I live in the diaspora. I personally can't stand that word because I don't believe I am living in exile. I'm not a displaced Jew. I am very much an American Jew. I'm not longing for return. And that became a really big question. Can you be a Zionist diasporic Jew? Or do you have to return to Zion and actually be the one building up the homeland? So the answer to your question, Brian/Dad, changes pretty much every 10 years. It's always changing. And really the war of 1973 in Israel becomes a really big pivot point for what that answer needs to be, to the point of what Israel really needs isn't quite as much more Jews living in the state of Israel anymore, though they'll always be very happy to take more Jews, but Israel really needs international connections and international support. And so one of the things that Israelis say about their relationship with American Jews and European Jews and Asian Jews, right, Jews who live all over the world, is that we really need your support. We don't need you to come and live here. We need your support. And that also carries a lot of different definitions of what support really looks like. Awesome. Did I see another hand and I forgot who it was? Great, Jill.
There we go.
There you go.
So I was born in 1969. And so when I was in Sunday school, very Reformed household, it was about visiting Israel. It was being a Zionist, right? And it was all about the support. There was never a thought in my head or my parents' heads that, me or my siblings would grow up and move to Israel. Not a chance, but it was about supporting financially, marching, talking, those types of things. Yeah. Never a chance that we would think about moving there, though.
Absolutely. And tourist dollars and tourism is even now a really big way that people support Israel, is by the economic support, as well as the political and goodwill and everything else like that. Phyllis, did I see you were going to say something or no? Awesome. Great. So all of these questions, all of these parts of the Zionist conversation are all happening in the middle 1800s, because the Jewish world, or majority Jewish world, there are Jews that were living outside of these regions, was really split into Central and Western Europe, and then Eastern Europe. Kind of the edge of Russia and like really Eastern Russia is where a lot of those Jews lived, and the ones who were kind of in. Sue, was that a question? Nope, we're good. Awesome. So the Jews who kind of lived in, we're going to call it Germany, because that was kind of the locus of identity, was kind of German Jews, were assimilating and becoming full German citizens. They were German in public and Jewish in private, and everyone was okay with that. But it wasn't a perfect world, but it worked well for them. But the Jews who kind of lived in Eastern Europe and on kind of that border of Russia, assimilation wasn't easy for them. And in fact, even if they tried to assimilate, it was denied by the culture that lived around them. And so when we hear about things like pogroms, we hear about them existing in those countries and in that region because the culture around them was very much unaccepting of Jews. Jews belonged in the shtetl. They did their own thing. Don't come into our world. We don't really want you. And the conversation started to become, well, if I can't feel comfortable in this land that's supposed to be my home, maybe it's not actually my home. And maybe the thing that I need to do in order to protect myself and other Jews around me is to find the actual home. And so those Jews go back to really all the way back to the Torah. In Genesis, God promises Abraham on the very first day that they meet, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars, and I will give you this land that I appoint you, and it will be yours for all the generations. And even 400 generations later, Moses, on his deathbed, at the very end of Deuteronomy, promises the Israelites who are all gathered around him, there's going to be a point where you're exiled from your homeland. But don't worry, God is going to bring you back. And so this phrase becomes coined, the ingathering of the exiles. The Israelites knew since the very beginning that they were going to be exiled, but they also knew that God had promised them that God will help them return. And so we get a couple glimpses of possible return a couple times during history. One after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year, not the Second Temple, the First Temple, sorry. In the year 586 BCE, the Israelites are exiled from the kingdom of Israel. They go and live in Babylon, and then the Persian king Cyrus comes in and declares a right of return. Some of those Israelites choose to return, but we even get an example of what that declaration was in our sacred text. In the book of Ezra, we get the edict by Cyrus the Great right here. Is that big enough to read, or does it need to be bigger still? Great. So Lisa, I saw your finger first. Will you read for us King Cyrus's edict from the book of Ezra?
In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, when the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah was fulfilled, the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realm by word of mouth and in writing as follows. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Any one of you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem that is in Judea and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. The God that is in Jerusalem, and all who stay behind, wherever he may be living, let the people of his place assist him with silver, gold, goods, and livestock, besides the free will offering to the house of God that is in Jerusalem.
Excellent. So Cyrus comes around. Excellent time to mention the Persian Empire, because as we come closer and closer to the holiday of Purim, that also exists around and in the Persian Empire. But Cyrus comes around and says, hey, all you Jews, if you want to, you can come back. if you don't want to, you can hang out in all the other lands. And this is really the beginning of a settled diaspora. It works fine for a little while. Different regions around Asia, Africa, and Europe have different systems of dealing with the Jews who live in their lands, until it becomes, especially in that kind of Russian borderland, it becomes untenable in the anti-Semitic actions and feelings that the Jews are experiencing. So here comes this guy named Theodor Herzl, a lawyer, a journalist, all sorts of good things. He was assigned to a very popular, pretty liberal French newspaper, the New Free Press, and is assigned to cover what becomes known as the Dreyfus Affair. So Alfred Dreyfus is a French national and a Jew who is a soldier in the French army and is discharged from the army and sentenced to death for treason, with very, very little evidence against him, other than the fact that he's Jewish and must not be able to have two loyalties. He cannot be loyal to Jews and loyal to the French at the same time. So Herzl is covering this news story and becomes convinced that Jews cannot live in anyone else's land anymore if they want to survive. They need to go and create their own land. And so he becomes known as the father of Zionism. He writes a book called The Jewish State. He writes a number of plays talking about the need for Jews to pack themselves up and move to what was then a part of the Ottoman Empire known as Palestine. Now, again, this becomes really complicated with modern Jewish politics and modern Israeli politics, but Palestine was more of a region than a defined border land in what we now know as that area of the modern state of Israel. Palestine was a nationality rather than a government. So Herzl and his buddies say, like, that's our land too. Look, see, Jerusalem is right there. Let's all go back there. Brian, I see your real and digital hand.
So question for you. Of course, politics being what they are, people can interpret things however they want. But if for Dreyfus, they said, how can you have loyalty to the Jews, which I'm assuming they looked at as a nationality and not a religion, and to France. But if be true to word, if Judaism was looked upon as a religion, what about how can you be loyal to the Catholic Church and loyal to country X? Why? What was argued along those lines, if anything? I don't know. I'm going to plead stupidity or negligence, but.
Well, a part of it was, and continues to be, a lot of, especially European countries, have national churches. It wasn't a contradiction to be religious and to be a patriot. It, just as it is now, but even probably more so back then, the definition of Judaism and the definition of Jew was really, really complicated. It was not so easy to say, oh, those Jews, like, that's their religion and their nationality is French. Jews were an ethnicity. They were a people unto themselves. They were, just like we say, like, Jews are a minority people in America, right? Jews were a minority in France. Pretty much any other nationality or any other ethnicity, it becomes, at least at that point, a point of conflict, that it wasn't seen that you could have two nationalities, two ethnicities at the same time. Now our world is a lot more complicated and you can be a lot of things at the same time. But it was much, much harder to kind of define Judaism as just a religion then. Other Brian Shergan.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, like when we talk about people we meet, so if you were to meet an Italian American, you would say he's Italian, right? You wouldn't say he's Catholic, you typically say he's Italian. But when people meet Jewish Americans, they say he's a Jew. It's very rare that other religions are singled out that way. So we tend to be, like you said, not just an ethnicity, a race and a nationality, a de facto nationality, even when we're in our home country.
Yeah. And even often, right, we're not just an ethnicity, not just a people, not just a religion. And throughout history, all of these different definitions of what is a Jew has kind of, those levers have been pressed in different ways. But even when you go to someone now and you say, you know, hey, I'm a Jew, there's even an assumption of politics in there. That there are so many layers. It doesn't mean it's right, but there is an assumption of politics in the definition of Judaism. So the thing that we are, even now, is complicated, and back then was extra complicated. Brian Heaps, I see you shaking your head.
I disagree with you as far as the politics, because you've got Reform Jews and you've got the Orthodox, and today, which you didn't have back then, you've got the Hasidim. So between all of those different things, the political views of the different sects, if you will, of Judaism have very different political views.
Yes, and what you named are streams of Judaism rather than political affiliations of Judaism, right? More traditional Jews are usually more traditional in their politics. It's not a hard and fast rule, right? You can have a liberal Orthodox and a conservative Reform. And other people outside of the Jewish community, don't have kind of the complicated view of Jew that we have internally. They, for better for worse, not always for better, they make a lot of assumptions about what Jew is. And so whether or not they're right, this term Jew usually comes with a lot of loyalty affiliations, one way or another. Lisa and or Brian, I don't know which one your hand is.
Well, the other thing, I think there's few other religions where, as a Jew, I'm thinking political on a global sense, people think you're pro-Israel. If they're not Jewish, right? They're going to assume you're pro-Israel, pro everything that is going on in Israel. If you're Catholic, are you pro-Italy? Are you pro, Roman Orthodox? Are you pro, that portion? No. So when you're Jewish, there is an assumption that you're pro-Israel and pro the politics that go with Israel, when
That might
not be the case.
Right, yeah. And especially, I'd say now,
Yeah,
the assumption is you're pro-Israel. Back in 1903, not only was that not a term used, but the Zionist movement started very, very small. Only a couple hundred people came to the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. And together they come up with a platform with just 4 goals of Zionism. Just 4. Seemingly really easy. Can't believe you managed to get more than 3 Jews to agree on just 4 sentences, but they managed to do that. So, Ross Wolfson, will you read for us the Basel program?
I would be glad to. Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine, For the attainment of this purpose, the Congress considers the following means serviceable. 1. The promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine. 2. The federation of all Jews into local and general groups according to the laws of various countries. 3. The strengthening of the Jewish feeling and consciousness. And 4. Preparatory steps for the attainment of those governmental grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So really their first goal is connection between Jews, making sure that Jews have employment and are self-sustaining, that they have a role wherever they happen to be, and that they are safe wherever they happen to be. The last point is maybe we'll get around to it. Hopefully we'll work with some governments to get us a place to achieve this Zionist purpose. Palestine is mentioned, but it's not like they're giving longitudes and latitudes. They know that they're going to have to use a whole lot of ambassadorships with all of the Jews to all of the nations of the world to try to get a place where they can be employed and safe and self-sustaining. Shurgins, did I see a hand again or no? Great. So this is the very first statement of Zionism. Let's get Jews safe and happy. And so from that, Theodor Herzl writes his 6-chapter book on the Jewish state. And really, even in his introduction, he focuses more than anything else on the idea of Jewish peoplehood. Not necessarily Jewish homeland, but Jewish peoplehood. So in his introduction, he talks a lot about anti-Semitism and all of that. And this is, his second paragraph. So Alon, you're leaning nice and close to the screen. Will you read for us this highlighted section?
Sure. I consider the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one, even though it sometimes takes these and other forms. It is a national question, and to solve it, we must first of all establish it as an international political problem to be discussed and settled by the civilized nations of the world in council. We are a people, one people.
Great. So, yes, Alon.
So the beginning of that really turned my stomach initially because it said the Jewish question, which is exactly what Hitler had talked about. So were you going like this?
You're right. Hitler didn't make it up. That question had existed for centuries. What do we do with the Jews who live in our borders? They're not like us. So what do we do? And it didn't always have the same kind of disastrous anti-Semitic connotation that it had in the middle 1900s, like it did with Hitler. But it did have these Jews are here. They're not like us. Why are they living in our borders? And here, Herzl is saying, if we're not like you, then you, civilized countries of the world, you need to help us find a place that where we can be. If you want to get rid of us, give us a land to go to. And so he comes back just a couple paragraphs later. This is, it's a little, these are just excerpts, and gives this paragraph here. Alon, will you read this one or two?
Sure. Palestine is unforgettable historic homeland, is our unforgettable historic homeland. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who will it shall achieve their state. We shall live at last as free men and on our own soil, and our own homes peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. And whatever we attempt for our own benefit will redound. I don't know what redound mightily and beneficially to the good of all mankind.
Yeah, he's speaking in super fancy English.
Okay, I don't know the word redound. Okay.
Essentially, this is the first statement. Palestine is our homeland. We will go there, and we will be in charge of our state, and we will make it so great that we will be able to take care of all Jews and kind of build us back up to the thing that we once were, which was a self-sustaining nation. This is the first statement of we are going back to there, and that's going to be our land. Now, Fritzl was great at politics. He knew exactly how to get all the people on board, who to talk to, what money to use. He had he had connections all around Europe and all throughout the Ottoman Empire. He took a whole lot of meetings. And he knew that it was that place that God had promised Abraham, and that the king of the Persian Empire said that all those Jews can go back to. That's the land that he was looking at. But he wasn't so sure how doable it was in the short term. These Jews are at risk all around the world. Maybe we need to think of a stepping stone to get us there. Let's find a place that Jews can be protected, and then we'll build ourselves up enough so that we can finally go home. So even in his book, Jewish State, he writes a question: should we go to Palestine or Argentina? Because that was another kind of locus of Jewish community. And he says Argentina is one of the most fertile countries in the world. The Republic would derive considerable profit from having us there. We would build up their economy because that's what Jews do. But the ultimate goal is to get back to Palestine. Just being there would attract Jews, and that ingathering of the exiles would be even more likely to happen if we were to actually get back to this land. So that question of going back to the area around Jerusalem, what was then known as Palestine is now known as the State of Israel. That question wasn't necessarily a let's get it done right now. It was more of a this is our ultimate goal, and we might need to be political and figure out places that we can compromise in order to eventually get to that. So, thoughts, comments, ponderings. I'm going to pause here because that's like a whole lot of information. Great. I've either totally overwhelmed you or explained it really well. Ross, yes.
So I kind of have either a philosophical or existential conversation or question that I have. I am not a product of the 40s. I was born in the 50s. And therefore, I don't have this direct remembrance of how things were when there wasn't a state of Israel. And so we're talking about how it was when all of my forefathers, my father, my mother, and my grandparents, and all my grandparents either came from Eastern Europe, from either Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine, and therefore were ostracized and couldn't be part of the community they were in unless they lived in the shtetl. And so I understood from them what it was like to find their own home and to flee the country that they were in because they never felt like it was a home. I also understood from my parents that having a state of Israel was comforting, but it was never going to be a place for them to live. And going back to Zionism and things of that kind, it just wasn't an issue for them because, after all, they lived in America and their parents lived in America. And so the the philosophical question that I have is the observation of the fact that I find myself as an American Jew. Now, do I consider myself an American first or a Jew first? That's the philosophical question.
Yes, and that is, that's the identity question that I grew up with.
Mhm.
Are you an American Jew or a Jewish American? Was kind of that big question.
Correct.
And I think as these generations continue, the question isn't what's my primary identity and what's the secondary identity, but it becomes, what does that intersection of identity really tell me about myself and the way I am in the world? What does it really mean to be both Jewish and American? And what is that unique experience? Right? That's that word intersectionality that we hear Gen Z talking about a lot, is they can have not just two identities, and really the rest of us can have, but they talk about it way more comfortably than most people. But an infinite number of identities, and they find their place in the world by where do all of them intersect.
Well, but it is true that there is still rampant anti-Semitism around the world, and just speaking of the United States, there's still a fair amount, if not rampant, anti-Semitism even in the United States. So the question really is, do I consider myself an American Jew or a Jewish American? I'm actually forced to believe that I'm a Jewish American as opposed to an American Jew. I still live in a very mixed area.
And maybe that answer is different from moment to moment. Mm-hmm. On election day, maybe that's the day that you're an American Jew, and on Rosh Hashanah, you're a Jewish American. And when we talk about the very complicated overlap between being anti-Zionist, not necessarily needing a homeland in order to be Jewish, and anti-Semitic, right? Right now, those words are used as synonyms, but in their original definitions, they were very different ideas. That the idea that someone can be raised as an anti-Zionist Jew is a thing that exists for many, many people who grew up comfortably in their home countries. But now, those words, anti-Semitist and anti-Zionist, they're just pretty much interchangeably and in a confusing way for a lot of. So, in fact, we're going to get to what does it mean to be comfortable in our homeland. So hold on to that for like 7 minutes, because we have yet to get to the Uganda proposal. Some call it a Uganda plan. Those who didn't like it so much call it the Uganda scheme. Essentially, the World Zionist Congress, and by world they meant Europe, meets yearly in Switzerland for the first 6 or 7 conferences. The 6th conference, Theodore Herzl gets up to introduce, to open the conference and introduce the things that they're going to be talking about, and comes and says, so the British have come to me, and they've said, at this point the British aren't in charge of the area of Palestine. That only happens after World War II, so it's still the Ottoman Empire, but the British come and say, we see that you've been gaining some power. We would like to be able to work with you. We've got this great land. It's in Uganda. Do you want it? In that proposal, they call it Uganda, but it's actually in Kenya. And so even the British didn't even really know what they were offering. And Herzl takes it to the Congress and essentially says, we've got a possibility here. We can go there, build up our economic strength, build up our national strength, build up Jews. Let's go check it out. And puts it to a vote. Of the almost 400 delegates, about 200 vote yes, about 170 vote no, and the rest of them abstain. So it's a really, really tight vote. But they put together a commission to investigate this area in Africa that might be promised. After that, there's very little documentation. We know that some people were put together. We know that they got on a train. We don't know how close that train got to checking out the land. But we know that the world Jewish community, who's starting to get on board with the Zionist idea, is seeing this commission go out into Africa, and they're sitting there going, "What's the deal, guys? You promised us Palestine, and now you're going to Africa? What's going on?" And even the communities in America that are saying, I don't know so much about the Zionism thing. We're pretty good Americans. Even they're going, if you're going to be Zionist, you should be Zionist. Why are you going to Africa? And Theodore Herzl gets the fuzzy end of this stick and gets a lot of flack for even considering this proposal from the British. And less than a year after the Sixth Zionist Congress, he passes away from a heart attack. He says in his diaries, I happen to have a copy of his diaries from some library that I cannot remember, therefore I cannot return the book, but it's definitely got the card in the back. In his entries in 1903, pretty much the only thing he says is, "I am so incredibly stressed, my heart is about to give out." He knew that this work of Zionism was incredibly hard. And he was so passionate about it, but in the end, it killed him. Wow. So he didn't even get to the Seventh Zionist Congress, where they vote and they say, "It was nice for the offer, but thanks, but no thanks." And they go back to focusing on Palestine that was in the Ottoman Empire. It sparks this whole conversation of not only where do Jews belong, but where can Jews call home? So in all of your conversations, what is home? I imagine that a good amount of people, and this is very much an imagination, you can tell me that I'm totally wrong, a good amount of people said, it's the place where I feel comfortable, it's the place where I'm safe, and it's the place where my family is. Yes? No? Right? Home becomes this really big identity piece for Jews around the world. And the ones who maybe had the family but didn't have the safety said, the place that I'm living now, that is not my home. But the Jews who had safety but maybe not their family, I can make this my home. Right? American Jews, German Jews, even to some extent French and British Jews, they were happy to become that dual identity people. But Eastern European Jews, they were never able to call their countries their home country. They were always going to be the Jew who lived in, rather than Jewish Lithuanians. So at the same time that Zionism is becoming this huge conversation among Russian Jews, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, you remember them from our conversation over the Trafe banquet, the Organizing Council of Reformed Jewish Rabbis in America start to make their own statements. And in 1897, when Herzl's first, getting really popular here, They totally disapprove of the establishment of a Jewish state. And they come in, this is the whole statement right here, really super short. We reaffirm that the object of Judaism is not political, it's not national, but spiritual, what we might call religious. And addresses itself to the continuous growth of justice and love in the human race, to a messianic time, not a return to the homeland that the Messiah would bring, but a messianic time when all men will recognize that they form one great brotherhood. It's universalism. Judaism is just one piece of who we are, but in the end, we are one great brotherhood for the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. I don't need to go back to that land that I don't even remember in order to find God. I can do that right here with my Christian and every other religion, brothers and sisters in this country. A couple years later, 1 year later, they continue to make statements. We are unalterably opposed to, now they specifically call it, political Zionism, the establishment of a political homeland, a nationally recognized state, an internationally recognized state. The Jews are not a nation. We're not a people. We're not an ethnicity. We are a religious community. And then they come in and they say this great phrase, America is our Zion. This hope for return to a homeland has been achieved. We are here. We have found our homeland. This land that God promised us, it happens to be Cincinnati, Ohio, or Manhattan, New York, or Philadelphia, or wherever they happen to be in this country. America is our Zion. It's a huge statement that this homeland is wherever you happen to find home. And Zionism keeps growing in popularity. It catches on and becomes more and more popular as anti-Semitism becomes stronger and stronger. So by 1935, this is way after the Uganda scheme/proposal, they come out and say, you know what? We're not going to take an official stand. It's up to everyone individually to decide if they're Zionist or not. So again, as Zionism is growing, anti-Semitism is growing, and so is kind of American unease with where exactly are we safest? Where are Jews safest? Us or those Jews all the way over there? Where are they safest? Until 1937, they finally come out and say, in the rehabilitation of Palestine, the land hallowed by memories and hopes, right? This is the land that we're connecting to. We behold the promise of a renewed life for many of our brethren. We affirm the obligation of all Jewry, including American Jews, to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland by endeavoring to make it not only a haven of refuge, but also a center of Jewish culture and spiritual life. Zionism is where we're at, 1937. It took a little bit longer for the modern state of Israel to become founded, but by 1937, American Jews are recognizing that Jews are not safe anywhere that they're not in control. And so Zionism becomes a necessary obligation for Jews, even if you feel safe. It is the obligation of all Jews to build up the land that will protect Jews and other oppressed people. It is that safe haven for anyone who is being persecuted. So this idea of home changes again and again. And we all know what comes after this statement, right? Zionism becomes exceedingly important and in fact becomes the next step of the Jews when they've realized just how at risk they are. So it still becomes a big part of the American conversation, but pretty much Jews who lived anywhere else in the world become pretty pro-Zionist. We need to create this Jewish homeland in order to affirm Jewish safety. I see a lot of gears turning in people's heads. So, Shelley, yes. I'm going to unmute you here. There you go.
Did you do it? Okay, thank you. What you're saying, I was watching the news this evening, and they were talking about Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, and they said, well, he was a comedian and he's a Jew.
Yeah, and in fact,
it just goes to show.
I'm even getting
if he were, they would have said anything.
Right, that idea of Jew, right? He's comedian, all right. That happens to be his profession before becoming a politician. He's the president of Ukraine. Also, don't forget, he's a Jew. And on a number of different newsletters that I get that, circulate within the American Jewish community and the international Jewish community, there's a bit of a concern that is what's happening between Russia and Ukraine going to lead to a rise in anti-Semitism. I'm not a professional politician, especially not in international politics. I am not an expert. But when conflict happens, often it becomes the minorities of the world that are especially at risk, because those loyalties become a question. And I believe that Jews are loyal Ukrainians, and also there are loyal Russian Jews as well. Not as many anymore, but there are some Jews who live in Russia. And, it becomes hard when, especially when it's not you're Jewish, so I hate you, but you're Ukrainian, so I hate you, or you're whatever, so I want to hurt you. What is our responsibilities as Jews to those people at risk, Jewish or not, right? If Israel's supposed to exist for all oppressed people everywhere, what does that say about people of color in this country, or other ethnic strife in Africa, in South America, right? There are oppressed people all over the world. How is Israel living up to that obligation? And one of the conversations that I had very frequently the year that I lived in Israel as part of rabbinical school is, can Israel be Jewish, free, and democratic all at the same time? And it is a really, really hard reality to agree with the ideal that Theodor Herzl and our Reformed Jewish forefathers kind of put together. Not always does the reality match the dream. Jill, did I see your hand up or no? Great. Other thoughts about Americans, Zionism? Do you see Israel as your homeland? Interesting. Anyone who is even on the edge? Lisa?
Brian and I were just saying we definitely feel a connection to Israel. I don't know if I think of it as a homeland, but definitely a connection of sorts. Like when we've been there, when we think about it, there's a connection. I wouldn't necessarily, not planning to move anytime soon, but definitely like knowing it's there and feeling that it's a safe haven, I guess, for Jews.
Yeah. I think that that's a narrative that we tell a lot is, Israel is great that it exists. It might not be my home, but just in case,
Exactly.
I'm so glad that Israel is there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm originally, my ancestors are from the border of Poland or Russia. I don't think I'm going back there anytime soon. So, and when you get to Israel, you get an embrace. At least I did. I went there when I was in med school and for a rotation, and there was an embrace that I got at that time that I've never gotten in any other country that I've gone to as a visitor.
Yeah. Alan or Sarah Turover, I can't see which one you are, but I see your digital hand raised. I'm going to unmute you here. Or not, it's not going to let me. Cool. If you want to type your comment, if you're having microphone difficulties, or text it to me, I'd be happy. I've got my phone right here. Or if it ever works, just unmute yourself and start talking. Ross Wolfson, did I see your hand?
You did. My comment is kind of a mixed bag. I'll say things like, Lisa, I don't think that I find myself feeling as though that Israel is my homeland, but I also don't feel as though that I don't feel disconnected from Israel at all. I enjoy going there. When I go there, I feel like I really am part of that lifestyle and part of that country. I feel like I am an American Jew or a Jewish American. And so I feel like my homeland is the United States, but I also feel very strongly about supporting Israel. However, I don't also have a strong Zionist feel, because I think that there are many things about the country politically that I significantly disagree with. And so, we're Reform Jews. Well, if we lived in Israel, we wouldn't be considered Jews in the eyes of the Orthodox. So I have a very hard time with that, and all of those things. So do I feel as though that if Israel wasn't there, would I feel disconnected? Because I think our people need a homeland. I do believe that to be true. But again, I don't feel as though that I need to be living in Israel. I don't feel as though that is my country. Yet I feel it's part of my heritage, and therefore I feel part of it. So it's a very disjointed feeling. Nothing straightforward.
Yeah. It takes a lot of explanation to talk about how we feel about Israel. And even that comment that, it's hard to feel a connection when you don't necessarily agree with a lot of the policies, right? That becomes a big part of our reform conversation too, that it becomes our responsibility as supportive Jews to point out the times that Israel isn't living up to its dream, right? Just like in our American community, we would point out when America is not living up to its purpose. We would do the same for Israel, and then it becomes that next piece of conversation, like, can someone who is not an Israeli critique Israel? But that's more of an internal conversation than a Jews in the rest of the world conversation. Phyllis, I saw your hand, and then Brian Heath, I saw your hand.
I'm a little discombobulated about how Israel became is run by the Orthodox Jews versus the Reform Jews, because it sounds like the Zionists were Reform. Were they not?
No.
I wouldn't define them as Reform because Reform didn't really exist in those kind of Russian Jewish communities. I would say that they were maybe liberal.
So how did we get to be run by the Haredi and the ultra-Orthodox sect?
And I also wouldn't say that Israel is run by the ultra-Orthodox and the various communities. I would say that the ultra-Orthodox have learned how to coalesce their political power in a way that liberal communities haven't figured out how to do. That they've learned that even as a minority in Israel, they can be a very loud minority and make the change that matters to them apply to more than just them. So
if Herzl didn't have his heart attack and he ended up going to Israel, where was he coming from, Jewish-wise?
He was an assimilated Jew. He went to a secular university and a secular law school and worked for a secular newspaper. Right? He was assimilated, but in his assimilation, he knew that he was at risk. So when it became a choice of leaving behind his Judaism, which wasn't really possible if Judaism is an ethnicity, or doubling down on his Judaism, he chose the second option. And he saw Judaism as a peoplehood, as a connection not necessarily to ritual like an Orthodox Jew would, but as a connection to people. So he would never have defined himself as a Reformed Jew or as a liberal Jew. He was just a Jew who lived at risk in society. If he had to put any words on how he defined his Judaism, he would have called himself a political Zionist, someone who's using international power in order to create a safe space for Jews. That's how he would have defined himself, I think.
When you were asking, what our connection to Israel would be, I love Israel when I'm there. I love a lot about it. I don't like the religious structure that seems to have the power it does. And if it didn't, then I might consider it as another option for where I might live.
Yeah, and that becomes a big struggle for the diasporic Jews, right? I would never use that word to define myself. I'm not a diasporic Jew because I don't live in exile. But the Jews who live outside of Israel start to struggle with, how can this be my home when it's not my values? And I think just like this country doesn't always align with our values, it's still our home. So it's not an easy question at all. So Sarah, I promised I would read your comment. Listen to the Israeli Midwest Council today, who has joined us a couple times here at Temple of Jeremiah. An Arab Israeli has been appointed to the Supreme Court, and Arab Israelis are a part of a coalition of parliament, which is an amazing thing and is a groundbreaking thing in the way this parliament has been formed. Women are also participants in all phases of government. Absolutely true, right? Israel is not just governed by the ultra-religious. We just tend to hear about them more because they are very loud in all parts of Israeli culture. But I would absolutely say that the ultra-religious do not run, control, or are the majority in Israel at all. Brian Heaps, and then one of the Kaufmans, it was only a digital hand.
Just a quick observation, which Ross started to make and you really completed. When we talk about the support for Israel, whether coming out of the US, whether come out of Germany or anywhere else, and the criticisms that we make and not have it, don't we criticize our own government? I mean, we're lucky enough that we live in a society where we're able to criticize our own government, but we look to improve things, and by improve I mean bring them away more around to our way of thinking, by speaking out for them, even if it's we can support something without having to agree with it.
Yeah, and often, we Jews who really like to share our opinions, the way we show our support is by constructive criticism. I know you can live up to this, so let me tell you where you're falling short. We get a little bit of Jewish guilt in there, but that I think people, especially of my generation, where support of Israel doesn't mean you can start to change from you always only have to say good things about Israel to the critical support becomes the way that my generation really starts to stand with and alongside of Israel without having to be a citizen of Israel. And then I'm seeing everyone on the screen and know that you have kids and many of you have grandkids. Talk to the next generation. That feeling of homeland doesn't necessarily exist anymore.
Correct.
Because those moments of conflict, those values are not my values, are almost too strong to overcome. That homeland needs to have, you need to be able to see at least some part of you reflected in it. And I think the younger generation is really, really, really struggling with that. And that connection, that reflection, doesn't really start to happen until a visit happens, and then the connection is to people rather than to land or to government or anything like that. So programs like Birthright get a whole lot of money. Programs like Nifty in Israel and trips to Israel and BBYO trips to, right? All of these trips to Israel become incredibly well funded because it becomes a huge identity builder for the next generation of Zionists. And then that generation goes, great, I'm going to Israel. I'm forming a connection with Israelis. Why aren't Israelis coming to visit? Shouldn't that connection go both ways? And it's also a project of Zionists that they're starting to take on, is making sure that relationship is really a two-way relationship and not just let's find some way to send my tourism dollars to Israel, but let's make it an actual real relationship with Israel. Kaufman's.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say something to remind everybody as we talk about our connection to Israel and our feelings about the country, how we all felt at the end of the 1967 war about Israel. And nothing has changed ultimately for any of us about how we feel about Israel underneath everything else. But, the politics and all that gets in the way, but you can't forget about those moments then.
Yeah, and, unfortunately, we need those huge moments of potential loss and eventual win to create that strength of connection. It doesn't necessarily just happen if we let time go by. But just like in this country and in our Jewish community, when we can win big together, we feel a connection together. I hope that we never have to have a war to have that happen. But then what do those big wins look like? How do we help each other live up to the picture that we have in our minds? And if it's not a connection to the political power, How do we ensure that the political that the connection to the spiritual, that the connection to the people, that even the connection to the historical becomes realized? Because Israel is actually not a simple definition, right? Israel can be a state of Israel, it can be a people of Israel, it can be a land of Israel, it can be so many different things, and you always need to include that something of Israel. Because when we talk about Israel, it's just as hard as talking about Jew. There's too many different definitions. I see how long I've kept all of you, and it's a great conversation. Clearly, we could keep going. But some people need to eat dinner, and other people on another coast need to go to bed. This idea of the Uganda Proposal, it's a weird blip in Zionist history, but it comes from a larger discussion of where do Jews belong and where are Jews safe. Not always the same place, but it's a conversation that still happens. We might not all decide to pick up and go to Uganda, also known as actually Kenya. But we might decide that it's time for us to coalesce our power in the larger world. Hopefully we don't need anti-Semitism and a risk of Jewish life in order to make that happen. But maybe that there are other ways for us to find our connection to Jews everywhere. There's a phrase in Hebrew, Klal Yisrael. We know that word Yisrael because we know Israel. We know that the name that Jacob had his name changed to after he wrestled with the angel, and now we are forever the people that wrestle with God. But Klal is comes from the word kol, all. Klal Yisrael is essentially Jewish peoplehood. How do we lift up Jewish peoplehood, even if Zionism and Israel becomes a really complicated conversation? We're all still people, and we're all still Jews. Might as well be Jewish people together. So thank you for learning with me. Next week, we'll get to Shabbatai Tzvi, the false messiah who loved the Torah. We might not have quite as many original source documents because apparently people don't like to republish things from false messiahs, just in case. But we've got a whole lot of news articles about him and what he kind of meant to the Jews who lived around him. So that's next week. If you have other hopes and dreams for our other two sessions, let me know. But next week will still be 100% online, and then after that we've promised to make every effort to be in person at Temple Jeremiah. Some of us, that's a really, really long commute, but everyone else will make every attempt.
Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Erev Tov, Lila Tov, thanks for learning with me.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Good night.
Bye all.
See you tomorrow.
I'll be here.